I want to just say thank you to everybody for being here and joining us for the Let's Grow. It starts here now. And we have a warm welcome for our presenter, Patti Ragsdale of the Happy Apples Farm.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Haley. As Haley mentioned, my name is Patti Ragsdale, and I am the owner and grower at Happy Apples Farm. I'm going to talk to you today about native plants for beauty and pollinators. So here we go. For some reason, here we are. This is a picture of me in pink right here in front of my house in Tonganoxie, Kansas. And behind me, you can see a little bit of my native plant garden. And the bigger picture in the background is of the native plants in their retail space where you can come and shop. This is right next to our house and my greenhouse. And so what I really love doing is when people shop is take them a walk through my garden so I can show them how these plants really perform in a home landscape. We do have a small herd of alpacas at our home, and they really are not there. We don't breed alpacas. We just have them for fiber, but they're really fun, and they help us manage our pasture. So what, I didn't mention this, but I am a graphic designer, a retired graphic designer, and what would have made a graphic designer want to sell native plants? Well, really, it's that they're beautiful. And so while I was studying wildlife management at MU, I discovered all of these different beautiful plants. And I thought, oh my gosh, why don't people put them in their gardens? So when I had an opportunity to do this, I decided that I wanted to share these with people, because I think that was kind of the barrier to people putting these in their gardens. So sharing native plants is what I really love to do. But then as I started doing that and planting these in my gardens, I noticed things happening around me like this. So hopefully you kind of get a sense from this video that this looks like a hummingbird, but in fact it's an insect. And this was happening right next to me as I was weeding my garden. It's a clear wing moth. And I began to wonder when I was seeing things all around me like this, was it the native plants that were attracting things like that to my garden? And most of us have heard about monarch butterflies and the population declines that they're suffering, and that it is related to habitat loss. And so a lot of us were searching for milkweed just to support this one species. And you can see in this photo from my rain garden a few years ago, there's a pink flowered milkweed called swamp milkweed. And on it, you can see an adult monarch and a larval form of the monarch, that's that caterpillar in the foreground. So what is a native plant? Now that is something that really, that definition varies with every individual. But I found this one kind of helpful, that native plants should be defined as those that have evolved and adapted to a specific location and have remained genetically unaltered by humans. So that would say that cultivars, say the purple form of the native ninebark, is not a native plant. A lot of people plant that, and it looks a lot like the native except for the purple leaves. Also, it refers to the geographic location. So in my garden, I have a plant called an oak leaf hydrangea, which is native in Mississippi. And that is not in the same area as me, right? But it grows here. And so I have it in my garden, and I call it a native plant. So that definition can vary with every individual. But the thing that really matters to me is that the plants I put in my garden more than just me and the beauty that I'm looking for. They're going to support a whole ecosystem, a whole web of life that lives around me and with me. And so if the cultivar of a plant or moving that plant into an ecosystem would harm an ecosystem or somehow not provide the services that plant was evolved or grown to serve in that environment, then I wouldn't want to call that a native plant or put it in my garden. I'm going backwards somehow. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Okay, so let's define what a pollinator is. A lot of us, when we think pollinators, think of honeybees, and bees are very important pollinators. But honeybees are actually from Europe, and the bee at the bottom is a bumblebee, and that is an example of one of our native bees. Another pollinator, very common for most of us to think of, is a butterfly, like a monarch butterfly. The one pictured at the top here is a native butterfly called a common buckeye that I find absolutely beautiful when I get one to stop long enough that I can see those beautiful markings. Beetles in the picture in the middle, those are also pollinators. They're often predators of some kind. That's looks like a soldier beetle and some kind of a web moth beetle right there. A webworm beetle, I'm sorry. Wasps are also pollinators. They're often predators in your garden. Flies, and the ones in my garden, they almost all look like bees, and those are called bee mimics. And the wind is a very important pollinator, and it's the one that when it's carrying pollen causes my allergies. I'm allergic to ragweed, and a lot of the term hay fever comes from that because it's also the pollinator for grasses. But butterflies and moths, I would say that's my favorite pollinator. First and second would be the bees, the ones that everybody thinks of. So butterflies and moths aren't really very intentional in their pollination or the services they provide to flowers. All they're really looking for is nectar. So as they move to feed on nectar from flower to flower, they're also moving a little bit of pollen. They are also dependent on plants in a different way, though. So the butterfly pictured here is a giant swallowtail, and it's actually on a non-native plant, a zinnia. If you wanted to attract a lot of butterflies, you would provide something like a zinnia if you just were trying to provide nectar. But if I didn't have the plant that butterfly needed, that butterfly's larva needed, then I probably wouldn't have these giant swallowtails in my garden. The plant pictured below is a prickly ash, and that little thing that looks like a bird dropping, that's actually a caterpillar. So if I didn't have those prickly ash growing all over my property, I would probably never see those giant swallowtails in my garden. Butterflies not only migrate as the monarch can illustrate that its life cycle includes a huge migration, but some of them overwinter here, and they can overwinter in several different stages of their life cycle. It can be the adults, so a lot of moths and butterflies will actually overwinter as a moth or a butterfly, but some are in the caterpillar form and some are in a chrysalis or the pupa. Here's some other examples of caterpillars and the host plants that they rely on. So we had the monarch with milkweed there on the left, and then at the top right, you can see an American lady caterpillar on pussy toes. And pussy toes is one of my absolute favorite ground covers. So I love seeing it too, covered with all these caterpillars. Amazingly, they don't do all that much damage to the ones in my garden, but in pots, they'll eat the whole thing. Kind of crazy. Most of the time, caterpillars don't kill the plants though. So that is it turns into a butterfly called a sleepy orange. You can hardly see that caterpillar, and I usually don't even notice it until it is almost turned that whole plant into a skeleton. That plant is called wild senna, and it always recovers to bloom and have a big plume of yellow flowers at the top that will provide nectar for bumblebees later on in the year. So these plants perform services for more than just these butterflies and moths. So bees are probably, they're definitely the workhorse in terms of pollination in the insect world. They actually intentionally collect pollen Most of them collect it for their young. Some, very few bees, but some bees actually lay their eggs in other bees' nests, and those bees don't really need to collect pollen, but a lot of bees eat pollen along with nectar as adults. Nesting is kind of an interesting thing. A lot of us think bees nest in hives like honeybees, but in fact it's a little different than that for most of the bees. And they would overwinter in that nested form. So we'll talk here. We'll talk a little bit about nesting, because that is where kind of some of the links for bees come into why native plants and native habitat is important. So there are two ways that bees nest. One is social and one is solitary. So the honeybee pictured at the top is the European bee that we're all familiar with, and that collects nectar and makes honey. It also collects pollen for its young and to feed on during the winter. So they would overwinter as the whole hive, as the whole colony in a hive, typically that we would provide for them. Sometimes it's in the wall of a house or an old tree. And they would collect pollen from a wide variety of resources and fly great distances if they need to do that. So those are social bees, and most of our native bees are not social bees. One group of bees, the bumblebees, is a social bee. It does have a queen and a colony, but the whole colony doesn't overwinter like the honeybee does. In fact, the only part of that colony that overwinters is the queen. So she builds the whole colony in one season herself, really with the intention of hatching a new queen who will overwinter and do the same thing again the next year. Solitary bees are the majority of our native bees. So that bottom picture there is of a little green sweat bee, and they are just like little tiny jewels that exist on your flowers. They are very small generally, and they are really a single female who builds a nest all by herself. And because they're so small, often, not just for that reason, but they really have evolved to use one type of flower, and often their nesting habitat is near that flower or provided by that same plant in some way. So they don't have a large ability to fly long distances. So some of the tiniest of our native bees can only fly maybe less than 300 feet from where they're nesting. To provide or find the resources they need to provision their nest. And bees that specialize on a certain kind of pollen are called specialist bees. So this is, I like this quote from Wikipedia because it kind of illustrates why a specialist bee might be of importance to people, because honeybees pollinate many species, but are often inefficient pollinators. If they are visiting 10 different species of flower, only 1/10 of the pollen they carry may be species. You know, I never really thought about that before in relation to bees, but the bee pictured below that looks a lot like a bumblebee is not, in fact, a bumblebee. It's called a rose mallow bee. And rose mallow, another word for rose mallow, is hibiscus. So our native hibiscus, this is one growing in my garden, and it has all these bees. The males will sleep in there and wait for females to come to these flowers. And she only goes to hibiscus flowers. So you can imagine, it's pretty obvious, every grain of pollen on all of these bees is from a hibiscus. So the pollination that occurs in this case is quite efficient. Another bee that is similar to this rose mallow bee is a squash bee. Interestingly, the habitat or the range of the squash bee has actually expanded because of our cultivation of squash species. So those relationships have evolved over a long, long time. And our use of native plants in the gardens can really, really help promote and support a lot of these native species. So nesting habitat I referred to earlier is an important aspect of providing habitat for bees. It's not just, the habitat isn't just that nectar or the pollen, but they do need places to nest. So a lot of us have heard about those bee hotels, and that is really providing nesting habitat for the 30% of our native bees that nest in cavities or stems. What's pictured here is a stem that's being utilized by a tiny little bee. She's excavated the pith out of the middle of this dead stem. You can see the sawdust or the messy way that she's left all that laying around. But that was an indication to me of what she was doing there. But she's going to crawl in there and place a ball of pollen on which she will lay an egg, and she'll seal that off. And her larva will eat the pollen she provided and hatch later. So 30% of our bees nest in that way. So they need those dead stems or bee hotels to provide that habitat. But the other 70% are ground nesting. And you can see, hopefully, in this video in just a second, a bee utilizing the ground in my garden as a nest. In this photo, interestingly, there's, or this video, you can see that bee crawl in there. That's a cellophane bee, I believe. But the nest she found, or the place to nest she found, was dry ground that had moved or pulled away from this landscaping rock. And she was going in there, and she has a tunnel that goes down. And then off to the side, she'll make a little cell where she will lay her egg on a ball of pollen. She'll seal that off and waterproof it, and then move and make another cell in that same, off that same tunnel. So habitat loss is really an important aspect of supporting or understanding habitat loss is important to understanding the declines in pollinators. And one pollinator in particularly is severely affected by habitat loss, and that would be the bumblebee. Bumblebees perform some very special services for our crops. And one, I'm going to try to look here. Okay, one thing that bumblebees do that other pollinators or other bees don't do is something called buzz pollination. Buzz pollination is what this bee in the picture is doing. It's probably a queen bee, but these downturned flowers that are closed at the tips are really helped by bumblebees that come along and they hold on to the tip like that and vibrate their body, which shakes loose the pollen inside that flower. Some of it falls out, and that's how the bee gets some benefit from it. And the rest stays in the flower, and it promotes pollination in that flower. So this important pollinator is suffering declines to the extent that Xerces Society says that up to 28% of our native North American bumblebees are experiencing some form or at some form of extinction risk. And that's really largely due to the fact that most of the habitat that they rely on has disappeared. Bumblebees have an interesting way of nesting. They nest a lot of times in mouse burrows that are hidden underneath tufts of undisturbed grass. So like when I hay my hayfield, occasionally will hit a bumblebee colony, and it's a dangerous place to get stung a lot, but undisturbed grassland doesn't exist in large quantities anymore. And let's see. Oh, here we go. So tallgrass prairie and the disappearance of this very important ecosystem is well illustrated by this map developed by the Nature Conservancy. In this map, the light green area is the historic range of the tallgrass prairie. Less than 4% of that habitat really remains these days. As you can see in the dark green in Kansas there, that is where the majority of the remaining tallgrass prairie exists. This ecosystem has been compared in diversity to rainforests, and in fact exceed the diversity you find in the rainforest. And it exists right here in the middle of the country where we are. We are the inhabitants of the remnants of this huge and valuable ecosystem. And I can tell you, it isn't happening just in the distant past. So this is my little farm, this little orange rectangle. This is where we live. And you can see we're in a pretty rural environment, not a lot of houses by most people's standards. That's 10 acres there. So you can see there are big pastures around, and those pastures have a lot of horses on them and things like that. But look at the trees, kind of look at that, because that's an important thing that's changed. They are in those kind of waterways, and then there's big patches of it, but it's really a very patchwork, like postage stamps of grassland all through here. And everywhere there's a fence, there are more trees. And everywhere there's a house, there's more trees. 80 years ago, it looked like this. So this is 1941, and what our property and the area around it looked like. So we'll look at that one more time. The encroachment of trees on grasslands has really made it almost impossible to manage this as grassland in a traditional sense. So the habitat that these bees, other pollinators depend on is largely gone, and it is very, very hard to find, even in an area like the one I live in, because most of these pastures are not prairie anymore. They're brome, which is the favorite pasture grass that everybody likes here. And it's not a native species, and they like it to be a monocrop of brome. So as we kind of think about, people inhabiting this and coming into these grasslands, what used to be a grassland, and how they're affecting that, I see a lot of opportunity, actually, because one, we have the pastures behind us that are largely grass, but maybe not a native grass. There's opportunity there, but really in our gardens, even if you don't live in a rural environment, you can create a beautiful garden that is not just for you. It's also going to support all of the beautiful insects and the rest of the life in this world. That it's constant entertainment for me, and it's like I walk into a natural area right outside my door, and I make it habitable for me and comfortable for me, but I leave a lot of the space for diversity that will serve the pollinators around me. Couple of books that were really important in forming my ideas about sharing my space with the rest of the world. And when I speak to the rest of the world, I'm not talking about humans, although I do share my space with humans a lot, and it's a lot of fun. But Bringing Nature Home is one of the first books, I think, that really managed to kind of break through people's understanding of the relationships our gardens and human beings had to the habitat destruction and the recreation and providing habitat in our gardens. He brought to light a study that found that just a pair of chickadees to raise one clutch of chicks needs 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars. So caterpillars are those larval forms of the butterflies we talked about. So leaving the leaves is really important. And having host plants is really important to supporting not only the butterfly, but those birds that we love. Same thing kind of happened in this book on the left by Benjamin Vogt. It's called A New Garden Ethic, and it really kind of made me question some of the ways that I was using plants in gardens and some of the things that I was doing. And some of the things that I wasn't seeing that are really beautiful, some of the relationships in just a very wild space that don't happen in gardens anymore. So I would highly recommend, you know, if you were wanting to kind of expand your thinking a little bit about gardening and why you do it, that these two books might help enlighten they enlightened me. That's all I know. So I'm sharing them and hope you can find the time to take a look too. So in my garden, the key, really the biggest thing that I want to do is provide diversity. I need a diverse foliage. I need all kinds of different blooms all the time to support all kinds of different pollinators. And I have to do that in a really small space compared to what they would have found in a natural habitat. And providing blooms throughout the season, that helps me accomplish that too. Minimizing mulch, as we said, was an important part of providing habitat for those ground nesting bees. And I can accomplish that too with that kind of dense population of plants, of differing plants, because those shorter plants are going to naturally try to grow, you know, and as the taller ones come in later in the season, those shorter plants are forming what would have been that mulched layer that suppresses the weeds. But underneath that, there is no mulch. It's just bare ground. And those nesting bees then have that habitat existing in my garden. And I don't ever even see it. I don't ever even have to tend it. But this, I should say timing of pictures, because this picture was end of May. This is really close to that space at the end of June. And then this next one is the beginning of August. So you can see that the garden changes all the time, but in all of those time periods, there's a variety of blooms available for the pollinators to access. One thing people might be wondering is how do you contain all that? How do you make that feel comfortable for someone? Because some of these plants are 7 feet tall. You know, they're very, very tall. So I do that in this way. I use a path. I consider my yard a path. It's very small. It's as small as I can possibly make it and still walk around with maybe a group of people to talk about my garden. And I don't like mowing that much, so not having to mow is kind of good. Not a very big space, at least. And then having an edge that contains all of this diversity really tells someone visually that this is a garden space. This isn't someplace that people are meant to walk. And so my garden is really the habitat, but the paths, the garden is the habitat for the insects and everything else, whereas the paths are the habitat for me. They help me get close so I can see all of this beautiful activity and all of the beautiful blooms. Winter habitat is another important thing to remember. I know a lot of us are probably hearing the leaves thing. So, and they're not mulched leaves, because if I pick those leaves up and I run them through a shredder of some kind, any of those overwintering larvae or adult butterflies or chrysalis, they're going to be destroyed, probably. So really it is just leaving your garden standing as much as you can. I do clean off paths. I clean off the little bit of grass that I have. And I try to leave as many of the stems kind of just standing up. But if they fall over, I do pick them up and put them in the compost. Leaves from the dead, the dead leaves that fall off of these stems stay in my garden forever. I don't really take them out. I trim the edges off to expose those rocks and things. And that's about all the cleanup I try to do. If I do have to cut stems down, I'll often bundle them up. And I try to wait until April to do that. I'll bundle them up and hang them somewhere where they're dry, and hopefully if there are any little bees in there, they'll still have time to emerge before those stems deteriorate. So winter habitat is important just for bees and for the butterflies and moths. So a few of my favorite plants, I'll just run through them really quick from top to bottom. The top one is wild strawberry. That is Fragaria virginiana. It's an edible strawberry, and it provides a what do I want to say? Evergreen mulch. It's all through the year. It's a ground cover. Below that are a couple of spring bloomers. The gold one is Pacra obovata. The purple one is Phlox divaricata. And once those blooms are gone, they're also beautiful ground covers. Below that is a spring blooming bee balm called Monarda bradburyana. It's short. It only gets about 2 feet tall, which is really short, and keeps its leaves. It's great, great garden plant. Below that is Golden Alexander and Rose Verbena. We saw Rose Verbena earlier, beautiful spring ground cover. And then the Golden Alexander, which is the Zizia aria noted at the left there. That one is a host plant for black swallowtail also, but beautiful lemon green, lemon yellow color. Summer favorites would include that my favorite milkweed for gardens, which is butterfly milkweed. And below that, you see blazing star, and that one is meadow blazing star. That is an early blooming blazing star. So it kind of corresponds to the monarch migration going north. Really important nectar plant for butterflies. They absolutely flock to it. So including blazing stars for if you like butterflies is a really important thing in addition to their host plants. Below that is another bee balm that I use as a kind of a filler plant. It's a short-lived plant that self-seeds, keeps coming up in between. The habitat remains right in there and provides a lot of blooms all through the season. So I just love it, and it's got a really unique flower. The last one on this slide is purple prairie clover. I don't know of a better plant for introducing kids to the habitat or the pollen gathering habits of some of our native bees, and even honeybees do the same thing. They run a little circle around that ring of pollen, and then they'll just jump to the next flower, which is often right next to it. So you'll just see them kind of going in circles around all the flowers. It's really, really fun to watch, and the kids just are totally entertained. I think I'm a big kid. I'm entertained too. So some more summer favorites, foxglove beard tongue. That's an early, it's a late spring, early summer bloomer. It's a white flowers on a spike, blooms for a long time, supports a lot of our tiny native mason bees. Below that one, you see everybody's favorite purple coneflower. So echinaceas are awesome. Any of them are great. I just put purple coneflower in here because it has such a long bloom time. So it's a good one for gardeners. The next one is black-eyed Susan. So Rudbeckia missouriensis is my favorite species of black-eyed Susan. I just absolutely love the petiteness of this one. And then my last summer favorite on this slide is a late bloom blazing star. Kind of corresponds to the southern migration of the monarchs. So they will flock to this one in the late summer. It's called rough blazing star or Liatris aspera. It's really my favorite. So fall, you'd find things like sneezeweeds. That's the picture at the top there with tiny bee on it. My favorite is actually an annual sneezeweed called a Helenium amarum because it's so tiny and it just comes back wherever its seeds fall, but it's super easy to grow and has a really long bloom time. But the perennial sneezeweed is Helenium autumnale, and it is a little taller than this one and bigger flowers and only blooms in the fall. Below that is an aster that's my favorite, and that one is aromatic aster. I don't have to clip it like you would the other asters like New England aster, but any aster is a good one, I think, to keep in your garden for the amount of nectar that and pollen that it provides late in the season. The next photo is of the rigid goldenrod or stiff goldenrod. Goldenrods are incredibly important. I never see more pollinators. So if you don't like bugs, you probably don't want that one. But it's an awesome plant. And I would highly recommend this particular species, Solidago rigida, for gardens because it does not spread by rhizomes. Don't forget to include some grasses. The one at the bottom of this slide is little blue stem, and little blue stem turns red in the fall and winter and has these fluffy seed heads that I think are really pretty. But grasses and sedges, which look a lot like grasses, are host plants for the skipper butterflies, which are super cute. There are a lot of places out there to get more information about native plants and the relationships to pollinators, and one of them is those free native plant catalogs that they send out. I've taken a picture of a page from Prairie Moon Nursery's catalog from this year, and they had a wonderful author, Heather Holm, develop this table of native plants and their what services they provide to different pollinators in their catalog. So you might check those out. They're really great resources, but definitely look at xerces.org. And one book that I got a shout out to my friend Betsy. She wrote this awesome field guide called Butterflies in the Kansas City Region. And Betsy Betros has done an awesome job of making it easy to determine what you're looking at when you're out there looking at a butterfly, and you can learn all about its life cycle from her book. I've listed quite a few other things there, including my website. And you can contact me if you want more information about any native plants. And the Kansas Native Plant Society is a great resource too. On the Missouri side, Grow Native, I'm a professional member of that organization, and the Missouri Prairie Foundation do a great job sharing all kinds of information about native habitat and native plants and resources around our area. So thank you. That's all I have today for spending your time with me, and come and see me if you get a chance, and hopefully together we can all make sure that our kids and our grandkids get to see images and views like this out your front door, just like they will out mine.
Patti, we have just a few questions.
Okay.
We're under the 5-minute mark, but let me read them to you really, really quick.
Okay.
First, how long, you might have gotten to this in the presentation, how long should we leave the summer and fall stalks so that the eggs have a chance to hatch from those native plants?
I would say, I wait until April. I try to not take them down before April 1st, but if you can't make it that long, I mean, just leave as much as you can tolerate. Often, as you saw how big and tall my garden gets later, those stems are covered up. So I kind of leave them, when I do cut them off, I cut them and leave them as tall as I can tolerate. And I try to wait until April, and then I bundle up. If I kind of feel bad, like I've cut off too much, I might bundle that up and hang it somewhere, so any bees that are left in those stems can still have time to emerge.
That's great. Okay, and what about harmful bugs like squash beetles? They hide and they lay eggs in the leaf litter. Is there anything we can do about that?
Well, that's in the vegetable garden. You know, I saw someone use kind of a trellis and move their squash kind of up a trellis, holding that plant up. I have no clue how to control squash bugs. I haven't yet to be successful growing squash. Other than, you know, I get good pollination because I have a lot of squash bees. But yeah, the squash bees always get my squash. I don't know what to do about those. I put all of the Chinese praying mantises on my squash. That does help some, because those things will eat my butterflies like crazy.
Okay, here's another question. Do you have any resources on where to buy native plants?
So Grow Native, which is a professional organization for native plant growers and suppliers, is a great place to go. So grownative.org. I am in that they list all the places where you can buy native plants. All their professional members are listed on their website, and they also send out a resource guide in the spring. So that's a good place to find. You can buy them here. April to October, I grow as many as I possibly can. So anyway, would love to help.
That's great. And here we have your contact info, and can get in touch if we have any more questions.
Oh yeah, follow me on Instagram or Facebook too. Those are great places because I take pictures all through the year to help people learn about native plants and when they're pretty and how they perform in my garden.
I like that. I appreciate the plant list, Patti. I made several notes here.
Awesome.
Things I want to add to my garden. I appreciate your pictures and your hard work getting ready for this.
Yeah, thank you. It was a joy.